Okay, for this analysis, we elected to evaluate hyperinflation in Argentina, specifically the Austral plan, which aimed to reduce the impact of inflation on the Argentine economy in the late 20th century. To begin with some historical context, in the 20th century, Europeans immigrated to Argentina, with the immigrants' cultural attitudes remaining in their original countries. Argentina, as a result, lacked cohesiveness within the political sphere, specifically with regard to clashes between middle class, urban working class, and various political movements. And these tensions resulted in no established plan for Argentina's economic future. Instead, each change in leadership, it resulted in attempts to restructure Argentina's political and economic framework and undermine the objectives of their opponents. The rise in Argentine economic instability and subsequent inflation began in 1944 when Juan Domingo Perón took power. Between the years of 1946 and 1976, there were 45 ministers of the economy, which demonstrates the lack of economic consensus within the Argentine government. This was due in part to its nationalization of the central bank, railways, and many other industries. And while the economy did not decline until the rise of Jose Alfredo Martinez de Jose's military dictatorship in the 1970s, inflation did grow during the years of 1946 and 1976 due to the budget necessary to finance a large public sector. Now to evaluate some more specific policies that drove inflation in Argentina. In the mid-20th century, Argentina adopted import substitution industrialization policies, otherwise known as industrial protectionism, which attempted to foster industrialization by forcing the production of goods that were previously imported. This was implemented in Argentina using high tariffs on imported goods, prohibition of certain imports, and taxes on agricultural exports, amongst other things. By implementing these policies, Argentina managed to permanently harm their agricultural sector, which was a fundamental part of their economy. Argentina also maintained a large public sector between their military complex and state-owned industries, which resulted in an expansive federal budget, which was primarily financed by borrowing from foreign and domestic entities and by printing money, which is known to be a fundamental motivator of hyperinflation. The figure on the right, provided by the World Bank, demonstrates that in the later half of the 20th century, Argentina's debt as a percent of GNI experienced expansive growth. And due to the expansive size of Argentina's bureaucracy and state labor unions during this period, any movement to reduce the state's involvement in enterprises was met by opposition from these groups who maintained political influence. And this figure provides a visual representation of how the factors discussed contributed to the overall state of inflation in Argentina. It's possible to observe that between 1920 and 1940, inflation remained fairly low, but as foreign immigration to Argentina increased and political instability became more present, and the factors discussed began to rise, inflation began to skyrocket in the latter half of the 20th century, which can be gathered by evaluating percent change in CPI over these decades.
So moving on to specific components of the plan, we have them broadly categorized as austerity measures, currency reform, and then a wage and price freeze. Beginning with austerity measures, as Noah mentioned, governments running up large deficits tends to be an important cause of hyperinflation. So there was an effort to cut these. This was done by having the central bank stop granting credits to the treasury, except to transfer foreign loans. This resulted in a more independent central bank that was not purchasing government debt, which research shows leads to better inflation outcomes. The slower inflation would also increase government revenue and would help make up the difference from the deficit cuts with the addition of higher taxes, closing up tax loopholes, and speeding up tax collection. This is also, they utilized tariffs, import duties, and price increases, which are substantially less popular with the IMF, although austerity measures generally tend to feature prominently in their stabilization plans. Interestingly, in his Venezuela hyperinflation policy brief that we read for one of the homeworks, Dornbusch advises against austerity measures in a time of humanitarian crisis. Moving on to the currency and monetary reform, this was headlined by the creation of the Austral, which was a new currency redeemable at 1,000 pesos, equal to 1 Austral. This currency had a set timetable of depreciation, which made the transition possible with fewer legal complications. There was also a fixed exchange rate to the US dollar. The other part of these reforms was sweeping contract reform, because if interest rates that are accounting for high inflation, if that inflation doesn't materialize, they very quickly become unmanageable. So in their quest to cut inflation, it was important for Argentina to renegotiate these domestic and foreign contracts. Finally, we have the most important and controversial part of the plan, which was the wage and price freeze. This was an attempt to decrease inflationary inertia, which happens when people anticipate inflation, they tend to progressively wage prices and wages, so that even if inflation in fact decreases, the prices continue to increase. So this wage and price freeze was used in an attempt to combat that. Surprisingly, it was supported by orthodox economists abroad and in Argentina, most notably the finance minister himself, Juan Sarri, who is a Harvard-educated economist, as well as many of his other aides. These wage and price freezes are usually unorthodox because they involve more government control and intervention, while IMF stabilization plans generally favor liberalization of prices, goods, wages, and interest rates in an effort to allow the economy to right itself.
So immediately following the introduction of the Austral plan, inflation did decrease significantly. What was previously almost 30% price inflation semesterly dropped down into the low single digits, which makes it higher than what we expect nowadays, but it's far from the runaway situation that had previously been up. This did allow the government some time to deal with the deficit, which was a primary goal of enacting the plan and required to make it or any similar programs sustainable for Argentina. Did it happen though? Kind of. The deficits were significantly lower than they had been before, at least in 1985, but they were still more than 5% of GDP, which is much higher than the target goal of 2.5% that the government had set. So taking a look at the actual inflation numbers, here you can see the semesterly CPI inflation in Argentina for the years 1984, 1985, and 1986, which would be the of the Austral plan as well as the two ending it. As you can see, the very high inflation from 1984 and early 1985 dropped sharply in the second half of 1985 after the Austral plan went into effect in June, although inflation did begin to creep up by the latter half of 1986. Speaking longer term, it becomes clear that the Austral plan was not, in fact, a permanent cure for the problems related to Argentina. As seen on the previous slide, by only a year later, prices were climbing back up, a trend which did continue. Deficits became larger, and opposition to the plan, particularly the wage freezes, grew. Prices and money freezing, which was originally intended to be temporary, but had to be done again by the government frequently, causing even more instability in the country. And finally, in the late 1980s, the government was ousted after inflation was back to being just as bad as it had been pre-Austral plan, and the new government put an end to the Austral plan.
Now, a study was conducted by Gabrielli et al. In 2005, where they studied the effects of inflation and money growth in the Argentinian economy. This study is useful to understand the effectiveness of reforms for hyperinflationary conditions in general. They found out that from the period from 1976 to 1989, where the economy was under hyperinflation and the Austral plan took effect, money lags as a response to price changes. Now, on 1991 to 2001, where these economic conditions, there was no hyperinflation, and these measures from the Austral plan were not being taken anymore. Then price lags as a response to money supply changes. That means that the response to prices, the response of prices to money is weaker than the response of money to prices in the 1976 to the 1989 period, but not on the later period. Which would be against the standard economic models where money stock creates a change in prices. We can conclude that the inflation of the first period had a price component that increased it more strongly than the money component did. And we can say from that price controls might be a useful partial tool for controlling hyperinflation, since money stock can respond to price changes in these conditions. Now you can see here from the graph that the lags in prices for the earlier period was negative, meaning that prices happened before changes in money stock. You can see that in the later period, the correlation is positive, meaning that prices were a response to money changes. And the VAR analysis on the right, can see on the upper right image that the responses of money to prices were much higher than on the left graph, where the responses of prices to money are shown, meaning that the response to money stock was much higher in that period. And you don't see the relationship happening on the later period in the 1990s. And these are references. That's it. Thank you very much.